Today we're playing Minecraft in real life. And this isn't some sort of cosplay kind of way, but rather I'm thinking about the game as inspiration for exploring my abilities to gather resources from my local environment and then turning them into blocks that I can build with. This project is sponsored by Minecraft, which is pretty awesome. And in fact, I actually started this over a year ago with some experiments in how I could turn my trash into some sort of recycled bricks. In the game, you start with just about nothing. And I'm going to take that approach with this video. So I'm going to start with really primitive tools that I make before making high-tech technical building blocks with more advanced power tools. But let's start with some of my recycling experiments. I'm going to start by recycling one of the waste materials that I get the most of, and that's cardboard. I had this giant box from an electric bicycle, so I just cut it into strips and then soaked it in water. Now I can mash these wet strips together to try to get the paper fibers to bond. I did this all in a device that I made out of steel, and at first I used a giant Acme screw to provide all the pressure. This worked fairly well for cardboard, and this block came out super solid. So I started trying the other obvious materials like aluminum cans, and then I added on some car jacks so I could get even more pressure and started crushing plastic bottles and even old paint and varathane cans. This worked relatively well as a prototype and it was pretty fun to just, crush things, but it wasn't that fast. And with these materials, with the exception of cardboard, I wasn't really producing enough of them to really make usable bricks. So if I wanted to make anything substantial with this method, it would take a really long time. So I decided to design a simpler version that could use a much more abundant resource. In this case, dirt right from the desert. With my furniture designs, things tend to get more complicated over time. But when I'm designing mechanical devices or tools, I try to take the opposite approach and get them to be simpler and more effective. So for this brick maker, I just started with some plate steel that was a little bit rusty because it's been sitting outside, cut it into rectangles, removed the rest, and then used my magnet clamps to hold the pieces at right angles so that I could weld them together. Now I want the inside of this mold to be nice and smooth, and I want the corners to be crisp as well. So I did the welds from the outside, and once the pieces were held together, I reinforced them with some pieces of angle steel. I'm not the best welder, but this kind of metalworking is pretty easy. Although I did have to grind down some of my welds to get the angle steel reinforcements to fit over them. Steel's great for making tools like this, and it's not that expensive. I mean, welding equipment can be, but all the cutting and grinding can be done with an angle grinder that's under $100. And all the steel for this contraption cost me less than $45. I want the mold to open and close so that I can remove the bricks from it. So I'm going to add hinges to one of the corners. Again, I'm trying to keep the inside walls of the mold nice and smooth, so I'm using weld-on hinges. I'm basically making like a little steel treasure chest for dirt. This thing is probably overbuilt, considering that I'm not using car jacks to pack in the dirt. I'm just going to use a hand tamper, but sturdy is nice. I used some small pieces of 3/4 inch angle steel to create a latching system. I just welded the first piece on and then held up the next piece right underneath it. I also added some pieces of angle steel at the bottom, and these have holes drilled in them, so this way I can screw the whole mold down to a board so that if I miss with the tamper, it doesn't move the contraption off alignment. Now I just have to drill holes for a pin, and for the pin itself, I'm just using some 1/4 inch steel rod that I'm bending so it doesn't fall all the way through. There it is. There's my tool. Now my new house is on 5 acres in Joshua Tree, which means I have a lot of dirt. And by dirt, I mean dirt that's mostly sand. Now the top layer of the land has the most topsoil, which is good for plants because this is where all the vegetative and biological matter kind of falls and dies and then decomposes into not necessarily fertilized soil, but definitely soil that things can grow in. Once you dig down about 4 to 8 inches through this topsoil layer, you get a combination of clay and sand, which is pretty hard and compact. And you can hear it here. The shovel just dings right off. This is going to be a much better building material than that topsoil layer, which is good because that means I can save the topsoil for gardening and, growing plants. So I broke up some of this clay and sand layer, greased up my mold, and screwed it down to a scrap piece of plywood. I do want the dirt to kind of bind together and hold like a brick, so I'm just going to add one ingredient other than water, which is Portland cement. Portland cement is the active ingredient in concrete. Concrete consists of Portland cement, sand, and gravel. This dirt is pretty sandy with a little bit of clay, but it does have organic material in it, so that's going to make it not quite as strong as typical concrete. I'm also only using a little bit of Portland cement, not nearly as much as you would proportionally in a concrete mix. And that's because I don't need these bricks to last forever. I'm not building a house or something that has structural requirements. I'm just trying to turn them into a basic building block that I could use for raised garden beds or for building privacy walls. I started with a 1 part Portland cement to 8 parts soil and sand. These are approximate measurements. I wasn't that precise, but in general, that's what I was going for. Added a little water and mashed it into the molds. The first one kind of stuck to the molds and slumped a little bit, and this was because I had a little too much water in the mix. I tried again, this time a little drier, and got a slightly better brick. Still was slumping a little bit. For the next one, I added just a little bit more Portland cement. So now I'm about like a 1:5 or 1:6 ratio of cement to dirt. This brick's leaning a little bit as well. And that's not from the mold. Again, I just can't quite get the mix right. It's either too dry and starts to crumble, or too wet and starts to slump. But they were still holding together as objects, so I decided to just keep going. A lot of making and designing is just trying to get a feel for a process, and I don't really expect it to get it right the first, second, third, fifth, sixth, seventh, or eighth time. But what I start to see by doing is a pattern. And I noticed that the brick started getting better the deeper I went into the hole. And the deeper I go into the hole, the more the dirt that I'm using has less organic matter in it. It's more sand and clay. So I thought, well, if that's true, what if I accelerate that improvement by rinsing the dirt and getting a lot of the organic matter to float up so I can then kind of dump out that kind of part. That leaves me with soil left over that's almost all clay and sand. And way more sand than clay, just a little bit of the clay. So now I'm trying a brick with the rinsed dirt and Portland cement. And I'm doing this in a tub just so I can, keep the contaminants out. I kept the mix nice and dry. And as I was shoveling it in, I could definitely see that it was a way more sandy kind of cementitious-like material or concrete-like material and less muddy. And the brick came out a little bit better. Still was slumping too much. So I really nailed the process on about like my 8th or 9th brick. And now all I have to do is start farming a whole bunch of them. It takes me about 5 minutes to make each brick, and it's quite the workout. So I couldn't make that many bricks in a day, but after about a day and a half of work, I ended up with about 60 bricks. I like that these bricks are made from the local soil, and they have just a little bit of cement in them, which means they won't last forever. I mean, they'll last longer than we do, but not forever, like solid concrete. So I thought they'd be good for a raised garden. So I designed a garden in Minecraft. I used sand blocks to build the structure because I felt that was the most representative of what I was doing. So I go back and forth from looking at what I designed in the game to laying out the bricks. Building stuff in real life makes me really appreciate the precision of the digital world. The ground wasn't perfectly even, and I got a little bit of leaning going on. But overall, I'm pretty happy with this proof of concept, and the bricks are quite stable. Now, Joshua Tree is known for being a very hot and sunny place, but I actually think the most dramatic weather characteristic is how windy it is. So eventually I'll make enough bricks to make a wall that'll give my front yard some privacy, but I just don't want it to be a monolithic barrier of dirty concrete. I want to weave plants into it. And by giving it some sort of three-dimensional articulation in a very Minecraft style, I can actually make little protected pockets of soil that protect the plants from the wind. All right, so proof of concept mostly sort of works. I now have a pretty cost-effective building material because each brick cost me less than 20 cents worth of Portland cement. Now, my power tool skills are a little more advanced than my, hand tool skills. So I decided to make some more technical, high-performance bricks using power tools. So this time, rather than pressing the materials together, I'm just going to make cubic molds. So I cut some melamine up and then screwed the pieces together, which is pretty typical of the way that I make molds for concrete. I don't need to add that many screws because I am going to disassemble this and reuse this multiple times, but I did make sure to seal up just the outside edges with some silicone. Now, I do like the idea of gardening, but sometimes I forget to water my plants. So one of the first blocks I want to make is one that can irrigate a garden automatically. So I cut the bottom off of a glass bottle to create a water reservoir. I still want to add some recycling component to these, so we had some yard trimmings that I hacked up with one of my ninja swords and then cut into short lengths. This is just going to act as a filler that I also think hopefully will give a nice aesthetic touch to an otherwise solid concrete brick. The cut glass was a little bit sharp, so I just sanded around the edges. And for the watering spigot, I'm going to use some 1/4-inch copper tube. This is soft and easy to bend, and you can cut it with just one of these tube cutters, which are really inexpensive tools. This is called a needle valve, and I like these because they don't require any soldering. You just screw the pieces around and then tighten them up with a wrench, and you get a nice tight waterproof seal. So I bent a piece of copper tube, drilled a hole in the cap, and then put that bent piece through the wall of the cube mold. Now I can use some hot glue to seal the copper tube in the cap and then screw on our glass reservoir. I sealed up the outside. Hot glue is awesome for this. I want the watering block to pour into a planter. So for the planter brick, I just took an old plastic bottle and glued the cap side down to the bottom of the cube mold. For my recycled stick block, I just glued those sticks to the bottom as well. Now, I recently had some burglars break into my house and they broke a couple of glass doors. So I have a whole bunch of broken tempered glass, which comes in these little chunks. And rather than throwing it away, I thought I'd use it as an additive for my concrete mix that I'm making. Because broken glass is basically just shiny gravel. Now this time I'm going really precise. I'm using a 5-to-1 white Portland cement to wash sand. This is completely rinsed off sand, so no dirt in it. And this white Portland cement and sand combo gives me a nice off-white concrete that's sort of the color of bone or ivory. This mixture takes pigments really well and is a really fun material to use for craft-sized projects. If you start with a pigmented concrete and then mix in some plain on top, you can get a nice gradient fade too. Now for the block with sticks, it was a little tricky to get the concrete down and all the way settled, so I probably ended up with a few air bubbles in there. Now the break-in was one of the reasons why I want to add some privacy fencing to the perimeter of my property. And I'm not a big fan of barbed wire, but I don't really exactly want people to feel too comfortable climbing over. So I thought for the broken glass, it would be kind of a nice, ironic twist if I actually used the broken glass to make a block that you wouldn't want to climb over. Basically a kind of masonry version of barbed wire that sparkles, but is also kind of sharp. Glass and cement is also basically how terrazzo is made, but it does require sort of grinding, which is pretty labor intensive and does make a lot of dust. But I thought I had to try it for at least one side to see what it would look like. I let all the blocks cure for about 2 days and then started removing the mold. The only part I had to be careful about was where I had the copper tube sticking through. I didn't want to bend it or put a crimp in it so that water couldn't flow. So I had to scrape away the hot glue and then pull it all out. I can typically get 3 to 4 uses out of melamine that I use for molding concrete, but it does take some time to kind of clean the pieces and to scrape off the silicone. There was so much hot glue gluing the sticks down though, that I had to use a putty knife and really kind of power through. I had put so much broken glass in the bottom that the concrete couldn't get all the way through, and that's why I got this nice kind of crystallized top, which you definitely wouldn't want to use as a handhold if you were trying to climb over a wall. The copper tube was a little bit long, so I trimmed it down, installed the needle valve, and then added another short piece that would be the kind of spigot. Some of my very first DIY YouTube videos involved making concrete planters and vases using plastic bottles. It's a really easy thing to do. It's not very expensive. The only tricky part is getting the bottle out, but if you have a heat gun, it's even easier. In this case, I just drilled a bunch of holes through the cap to kind of weaken it, and then twisted and pulled it out with pliers. The sticks got a lot of concrete on them, so I just sanded down the ends to get them nice and clean. I actually really like this aesthetic. It kind of looks like cordwood masonry. Google that. It's like a way of building houses where you use kind of like mud and cement with logs to make a really solid wall. I ground down one of the walls of the glass brick, and it definitely did look like terrazzo. Now, if I wanted to make real terrazzo, I would have to change the mixture and use a lot more Portland cement to make a stronger concrete. But this was a pretty good facsimile, and it was pretty cheap and easy. All right, I tested out the watering brick, and it works. Flower pots need drainage, so that's why I had glued the bottle down to the bottom, because the cap creates a hole that, water can drain from. That means I have to put some gravel before I put soil in and add the plant. The gravel just creates a nice drainage layer. I used one of my plain blocks as a spacer, and now I have a little garden for my rosemary plant, and I can set the needle valve for a nice steady stream, or I can just keep it just a little bit open so that it slowly drips in. I really like making things. For me, it's exercise, it's a way to de-stress, but I don't always know what I want to make. What I really like about this project and this collaboration is that if I don't have a clear idea, I can just make a brick. And over time, I'm going to have a bunch of bricks. And then all of a sudden, if I have an idea, I got a head start to creating something special. Thanks to Minecraft for sponsoring this project. And let's think about video games not just as a way to mindlessly entertain ourselves, but as a way to learn strategies and skills that can apply to real life. I really appreciate that in Minecraft, there isn't just one type of generic tree. The different trees have different properties when you harvest them into materials. And it's really cool that there isn't just one kind of dirt. The different blocks of dirt have different technical properties. So sure, we want entertainment and fun, creative ways to pass time, but let's not forget that those things can also translate into real life.